Welcome to Love and Balance, your go-to podcast for psychology-based, life-enriching information. I'm Bryan de Justin, a certified child, family, and relationship life coach. In each episode, I'll share psychology-supported tips, advice, and insights to help you grow personally, enhance your family life, and strengthen your relationships. Join me as we explore how to love yourself, love others, and live a balanced life. In this episode, we will be talking about the Cain Complex, what it means and how it relates to sibling rivalry, its impact both on people and on the families that are involved. Are you related to someone with a Cain Complex? Stay tuned to find out. Greetings, and I hope everyone is doing well. Thank you for tuning in. Before I go into today's podcast, I want to discuss first what a complex is. A complex in psychology, especially psychoanalytic psychology, is a group of emotionally charged thoughts, feelings, and memories that are organized around a certain theme or concept, which are often related to an individual's past experiences. But this conglomerate of feelings and thoughts, though they may relate to past events, still affect the present and the future. These complexes can significantly influence a person's behavior, thoughts, emotions, and even the way they see life. And often these complexes operate unconsciously. So the person usually isn't aware that they have this. And to them, typically it's because it's been normalized. Complexes are usually formed through repeated experiences or strong, singular, powerful ones. Or they can also be unresolved conflicts, typically internal conflicts that are triggered by situations or stimuli that resonate with the underlying theme of the complex. For example, someone with a father complex, which has a name, but I'll go over that in another episode, might have deeply rooted feelings and reactions related to their father. So when a negative experience happens with a romantic other, which can be a man, this will influence their interactions with them, or potentially other authority figures or male role models. So complexes are incredibly important, and they're a significant aspect of the psyche of the person. These complexes color our personalities, our relationships, even our job selections, and many intimate and profound aspects of our life are also colored by these. As I mentioned, many people have these, and there are many complexes. I can name 10 off the bat, and there will still be many left over. But in psychology, the popular ones are the Oedipus complex, the superiority complex, the inferiority complex. But these are just really a few, and there's so many more. And because of this, the majority of people have, at the very least, traces of these complexes, either resolved or unresolved. I'm going to do a series on all the different ones, so stay tuned. But for now, my own personal definition of complexes, which I discuss in a book I'm releasing soon, is that complexes are characters or psychological entities that exist within us. And we, through identifying with them consciously or unconsciously, we carry out the same character as if we were a theater. Our lives are theaters, our lives are plays, and the complexes are the characters that we pick to actuate in the play of life. Everyone has a good and bad, a Cain and an Abel. And the key to personal growth, which I emphasize in my life coaching practice, is that whether one is conscious of it or not, one is responsible for controlling and understanding these internal characters. There's a saying in psychoanalysis accredited to another psychoanalyst named Gandhi, who says that within every Cain there is an Abel, and within every Abel a Cain. So complexes, which the majority are named after mythological, literary, or historical figures like Napoleon, Oedipus, Moses, Hercules, etc., are symbols that, living inside us, lose control and develop psychopathically in worse circumstances. Now, the complex I'm addressing today, which in my opinion will be easily recognized by many of you listening because of how common it is known as the Cain Complex. Now, what does this have to do with the episode of today? I chose this complex because I believe it is one of the most predominant, yet so normalized. And since it is so normalized, I don't believe a lot of people regard it as an issue. Now, before I go into the Cain Complex, I must tell you about the person it is named after. Now, the majority of you will indeed recognize this name. It's named after one of the most dramatic and artistically represented episodes of the Bible after the crucifixion. It's the story of Cain and Abel. Now, for those of you who don't know this story, I will narrate it. After Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had 2 sons. Their firstborn, the first child ever born, was Cain. Later, they had another son named Abel. As they grew, Cain and Abel were commended to do different duties. Cain was in charge of the agricultural affairs, while Abel was in charge of the pastoral affairs. Cain tended the crops, while Abel tended to the livestock. Now, as the biblical narrative states, Cain became gradually more jealous and envious of his younger brother Abel. Eventually, this jealousy and envy accumulate and reach its peak when Cain and Abel offer a sacrifice to God, and God the Father rejects Cain's but accepts Abel's. These intense negative emotions at that moment of rejection that bubbled up within Cain burst to such an extreme that Cain kills Abel. Afterward, God the Father manifests himself and asks Cain, "Where is thy brother?" And Cain responds, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Immediately after this sarcastic reply, God curses Cain, who at this point is suffering intense anxiety and paranoia, and he is doomed to wander the world forever. Now, this is the biblical narrative. However, the legendary versions expand on this. Remember that the actual stories of the Bible are older than when they were written. At that time, not many people could write, and to write a chronicle of something was an expensive task, and arduous and time-consuming as well. So legends that either precipitated, paralleled, or followed the story developed with it as well. Nonetheless, these legends were propagated because they were believed as well, and are considered extensions of the biblical narrative. And this legend is especially noted in a book called The Book of the Cave of Treasures. It's a Syriac Christian chronicle that was discovered that details the 4,000-year-old story and expands on this even further. So according to legend, after Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel, who in a lot of legends are regarded as twins, they also bore 2 twin sisters, Awan and Azura. Awan was given to Cain as a wife, while Azura, the most beautiful of the 2 sisters, was given to Abel. This caused Cain jealousy because he felt that as the oldest sibling, he deserved the most beautiful of their sisters. Out of his sexual jealousy, he kills Abel, who is his sexual competitor. Now, the legendary version is much more detailed and intimate than the biblical one. In the legendary version, which in my view is complementary to the Bible and in no way removes from it, Abel recognizes and knows that Cain is jealous of him. He even tells him, "I know you have been jealous of me since we were little children, but why do you feel such a way when all I feel for you is love?" After the sacrifice, Adam and Eve celebrate the fact that God accepted Abel's sacrifice, so much that they kiss Abel on the face and cry out with joy and thank God for having accepted Abel's sacrifice. Now, on the contrary, when they see that God rejected Cain's sacrifice, they cry and they lament and they pity him that God rejected him. So, of course, they do not celebrate this. Cain, because of this moment, is seething with anger and resentment. So he explores his evil sentiments and he elaborates mentally what is it that he is going to do to repay this injustice in his mind. Disregarding all principle and moral obligation, he invents an evil plan and he goes to Abel and tells him that he wishes to make amends. he lies and says that he wants Abel to love him and he wants to love Abel. So he apologizes for his misbehavior towards Abel, because earlier in the story it tells how when Cain and Abel were little, Cain would do things to try to sabotage and bully Abel, but by divine intervention, Abel was protected. So Cain tells Abel that he wants to begin loving him the way a brother should love him. And Abel, of course, is overjoyed to hear that finally his brother has decided to put his hatred aside and begin making the active choice to love him. Cain tells Abel that the perfect way to demonstrate his love and brotherly promise to his younger brother is to go to the altar which they have built to pray. Cain invites Abel to go on a walk with him together to the altar, and Abel happily obliges. As they are walking side by side, Cain tells Abel that they should walk one way. Abel questions this and asks why they should walk such a way when the other way, which is the one they typically take, is faster. Cain is stuck because he doesn't know what to respond to this. But as he's trying to figure out a clever response, Abel declares that as the younger brother, he must obey his older brother. So if Cain, being older than him, thought that it was best, it would be best that he would follow orders without questioning. So they walk a certain distance in the direction that Cain indicated until Cain tells Abel, "Abel, it is dangerous for you to walk side by side with me. If an animal attacks you, I will have no way to defend you. Walk in front of me a certain distance, and I will watch over you from behind." Abel, of course, feels like this is the absolute expression of brotherly love and happily walks in front of him. As they walk, Cain is bursting at the seams with hate. Abel, all the while, is walking innocently without suspect. Until eventually, Cain strikes his little brother over the head and tries to strangle him. Abel looks into the eyes of his brother as he is choking him and tells him, and I quote, "O my brother, have pity on me. By the breast we have sucked, do not hit me. By the womb that bore us and that brought us into this world, do not beat me to death. Please, if you are set on killing me, take one of these large stones and kill me." Then Cain took a large stone and beat his brother's head with it, and he bathed in his blood, and Cain was not sorry for what he had done. End quote. So then after this, God descends and asks Cain, "Cain, where is thy brother?" And God asks it, not in ignorance, of course, but out of repentance, so that if Cain were to say, "I have killed him," and would have lamented his condition, he would have forgave him. But Cain was not sorry for what he had done. And actually, in the legend, it's actually God the Son, not the Father, who exchanges in this dialogue with Cain. So God the Son, who is essentially Jesus pre-incarnation, descends and upon hearing Cain's sarcastic reply, tells him, "Be trembling and quake, suffer trembling and terror." And Cain, at this moment, when God tells him this, God the Son, he is struck with paranoia and anxiety to the point where he screams out in agony, "My crime is too much for me to bear." And he continues on his days afflicted with this curse, but never sorry for what he had done. At the time Cain killed Abel, Cain was 15 and Abel was 12, something not many people know. The last version of the story is the tying together of all the Cain and Abel legends into one legend. So the writer of the Book of Adam and Eve, which is also known as the Conflict of Adam and Eve, likely what they did was compile all oral and written traditions of the Cain and Abel saga, including the biblical one, and just merged them all into one, both the oral and the literary traditions. So as you can see, this complete and comprehensive version goes to great extents to illustrate not only the episodic elements of the story, but the psychological ones as well. We also get to see, in essence, a behind-the-scenes version of the biblical version. So as I analyze this story, we can see that Cain's jealousy of Abel started when they were children. Unlike the biblical version and its narrative, we can see that Cain's jealousy came out not from one singular powerful occasion. No, this was a whole life of jealousy, life in the sense of their age. Cain and Abel were 3 years apart, so it can be assumed that Cain was 4 or 5 years old, and up until he was 15, he had been feeling this way about Abel. Now, some of you may be wondering, is it possible for a child to feel such jealousy at that age? Yes, absolutely. Children can feel jealous of others from as old as 18 months. So yes, Cain was absolutely capable of feeling that way. And this jealousy that Cain felt was also nourished not only by internal events, but actual literal ones that are in the external world as well. For example, when Adam and Eve celebrate their sacrifice, well, rather the sacrifice of Abel, and their arranged marriage, we can see that from Cain's psychological standpoint, he experiences these events not as achievements for his younger brother or milestones or spiritual milestones. No, he sees them as humiliations. He sees these as insults, and on the part of his brother. That's the important part. He does not hate Adam and Eve or God for that matter. No, he, on the contrary, loves his parents and loves God, who is also his parent in the story. He simply hates Abel. So it is this love that he feels and this competition over his parents' admiration and affection, and I mean both biological and heavenly parents, that drive him to do this. He kills Abel out of love of God and his parents. We also see how vindictive and conniving Cain was. His goal and objective wasn't just to commit bodily harm. No, it was also to commit psychological and emotional damage. The point of Cain was to cause pain and suffering, not just pain alone. No, he wanted the suffering as well. And we see this because as he is writhing in jealousy and hatred, he formulates this sinister plan. So he's actually diving into this darkness and manifesting it and embodying it. And he's thinking about what would be the most satisfying, the most pleasant, the most pleasurable way to carry out this plan. And he elaborates it in his mind. See, because he isn't thinking about what he has to do. No, he knows what he's going to do. He knows that the eventual end will be murder. He knows. He's just thinking about how he is going to do it in a way that satisfies his revenge fantasy. So he tricks Abel into thinking that he has decided to make peace with him and wants to make a brotherly oath of love and protection with him, and for the end to just be this brutal betrayal and revenge story. And we read in the legend that Abel was innocently and happily walking. Remember, he's 12 years old. He's a little boy. And because his older big brother told him that he wanted to protect him from wild animals, of course, he felt tender. Cain successfully, at this point, dismantled Abel's psychological guard and boundaries and makes him trust him just to strike when he least expects. Cain wanted to cause Abel despair, and so he did, to the point where Abel asks him, as Cain is strangling him, to at least show him a little mercy and not beat him or strangle him, but to rather beat his head with a rock. And the book of the Cave of Treasures actually goes into graphic detail, which I won't in this episode, but you can imagine what it says. Abel in that moment feels emotional anguish because Cain did to him what he least expected his big brother to do. So after Cain slaughters, because that's what it is, he didn't just kill Abel, no, he slaughtered him, and you can read the story for yourself for that detail. It says that Cain rolled around and bathed in Abel's blood. So this wallowing and this bathing in the blood of a kill, whether it's a human or an animal, conveys an extreme animalistic, psychopathic state of mind. Bathing and pouring the blood of your victim on you, it's clearly a psychopathic act. So at this point, when Cain does this, He's feeling a sense of triumph, a sense of victory, of freedom, and even ecstasy and euphoria. Cain is so happy to the point where he rolls around maniacally in Abel's blood. The book doesn't say this, but you can imagine that Cain, as he was doing that, was laughing. So this murder scene clearly depicts an explosive event. No, this wasn't spontaneous. It was an accumulation of negative, evil feelings that, once reaching their peak and triggered, exploded into this intense and combustive episode of epileptic and apoplectic anger. So God the Son, who, as I mentioned, is essentially Jesus before the incarnation, places a curse on Cain. Now, many people, including theologians, have disagreed and argued for centuries over what this mark of Cain is. However, I think psychology illuminates this very well. It's clear that the cursed mark placed on him was actually the curse of perpetual fear and dread and terror, almost paraphrenia. So it wasn't a physical mark that God put on Cain, no, but a psychological one. So when God the Son speaks, he gives the command to Cain's body and mind when he says, "Tremble and quake, suffer trembling and terror." God the Son is commanding not only Cain's body to shake and fear, he is commanding also his mind to fear terror. Terror is an emotion. It's a psychological reaction. So God the Son commands Cain to feel these both. I would even go so far as to say that Cain at this moment had paranoid schizophrenia, because in both legend and biblical texts, Cain shouts, "Anyone that findeth me shall kill me." This is interesting because at this time, the only people alive on the planet were Adam, Eve, Abel, which is now dead, Cain himself, and their twin sisters. So if Abel was dead when he said this, then who would find Cain and kill him? This clearly means that Cain was suffering from paranoid hallucinations and was in fear that Abel would return as an avenging spirit. So Cain was afraid of his victim's ghost. Of course, this is the manifestation of his guilty conscience and the paranoia he feels. The Cain and Abel saga clearly highlights the elements of jealousy, competition, love, and passion. Western religions, unlike Eastern ones, are not shy to demonstrate how passion can be both salvation and the destruction of people, especially families. Now, I analyzed the Cain story because it tells us about the Cain Complex, as well as the people who have it in excellent detail. The Cain Complex, thus, is a psychological construct that describes a profound and often unconscious sense of rivalry between siblings. This sense of rivalry is marked by jealousy, resentment, and aggressive impulses. These feelings may arise from either one or both of the siblings and stem from perceived parental favoritism, competition for love and recognition, or underlying conflicts relating to identity and self-esteem. This complex can lead to destructive behavior, either towards the sibling or through self-sabotage, reflecting the internal struggle between envy and guilt. People who have the Cain complex usually experience unconscious rivalry, so the complex operates below the level of conscious awareness, and that drives these behaviors and these emotions that the individual might not fully understand. They might also feel envy without guilt. So the Cain complex involves intense envy of the siblings' perceived advantages without the presence of guilt, rather justification. The person who feels this way and who has the Cain complex feels that they are justified and they have good reason for feeling this way. People with the Cain complex also use projection and displacement, which are defense mechanisms that individuals use. Individuals may project their own insecurities onto their sibling, viewing them as the source of their discontent, or just displace their aggression onto others. In psychology, many people are aware of the Oedipus complex, and the Cain complex completes what the Oedipus complex doesn't. The Oedipus complex involves one's parents, so the Cain complex involves one's siblings. And the Cain complex, of course, is linked to it as a result. So the sibling, rather than the parents, are seen as a rival for affection and approval. People that have an intense Cain striving, which is essentially the internal version of ourselves that is evil and is capable of destructiveness, and the instinct, which also exists inside everyone, are unprincipled, intolerant, malevolent, malicious, wounding, possessive, disrespectful, and may even be capable of homicide or suicide, because suicide is just the aggressive impulse turned inwards. So the Cain striving, which, like I said, is the evil side of us. It's also related to the concept of the Cain within, which is the evil side of ourselves, and is closely linked to crimes of passion. If you break it down, people who commit crimes of passion go through exactly the same thing as Cain. People who commit crimes of passion, like Cain, detach themselves from the world. So at the time before the murder, nothing matters to them and everything just crumbles around them. After, all their values related to human life, to God, to morals, to family, to love, etc., are demolished. And during this depreciation of values, that's when the internal Cain awakens. And when this awakens, that's when the homicidal intent, or the Cain striving, reaches to such a strength that it accumulates to an unbearable amount. And this causes tension within them. When this tension is building up, a fuse is ignited. So for example, in crimes of passion, it's usually an infidelity or something of the sort. This fuse is ignited, and then suddenly, boom, the dynamite of aggression explodes and the homicide is completed. Mythology was born out of an initial act. All mythologies are born out of something real that happened, which became symbolic for man. So this reflective, thematic, moral symbol that occurred in the community at that time then led to a mythic generalization of the experience, which provided early humans with insights on life. So thus the story is as real as it exists within every person, and it constitutes an actual, real, significant event in human history. And current anthropological science supports this, actually. As a matter of fact, it's been found that mankind's ancestors 3 million years ago left behind bashed-in skulls of their prey. And remember, Cain either beat Abel with a club or a stone. So this evil instinct is indeed part of our inner primitive nature. Since the beginning of evolution, mankind has been fighting for survival. And in a family, siblings are born in a naturally competitive environment. The environment that siblings are born to is inherently competitive by the very fact that parents do not have an infinite supply of love, of time, and attention to give to all their siblings at once. That's impossible. So then the accomplishments of one sibling might be the humiliation of the other. And parents, whether consciously or unconsciously, may participate in this. For example, remember Adam and Eve celebrate and kiss Abel as congratulations for God accepting his sacrifice. But at the same time, when they see what happened to Cain, they feel sorry and they pity him. So if we put Bible and legend together, the Cain episode manifests several reasons for why this jealousy can occur, either due to the parents or not. And sometimes parents don't realize that they act in this way because, again, it's unconscious. So if we put the Bible and legend together, as I mentioned before, we can see that the Cain episode shows us different motives and attributes of these people. Cain feels hatred and envy in the Bible, but in legend, he feels sexual jealousy and the subsequent desire for possession through sexual competition. But in both, he feels anxiety, prior to penitence. And he goes through punishment, is mentally unstable, and he is in perpetual flight mode thereafter. Ultimately, Cain needed acceptance by his father, Adam, and God, and envied his brother. He had a drive for possession, and he struggled over a privileged position in the family. His murder of Abel expresses a need for his father's love and protection. And the great terror that Cain felt is the anxiety of rejection. So evil doesn't arise here from a sense of powerlessness, but rather a profound need of acceptance. People with the Cain complex feel the same way. They feel rejected, hated, discarded, and slighted. The Abel in this instance might not even do anything wrong and may love their sibling, but are nonetheless hated. Here's another way to identify someone with a Cain complex, whether it be someone you know or even a sibling or a family member. People with high Cain strivings who almost always have the Cain complex as a consequence tend to work with fire or high temperatures. Interestingly, the word Cain means smith, and Tubal-Cain, Cain's seventh son, inherited the family name and thus vocation. So he was a blacksmith. People with the Cain instinct or complex are very often firefighters, bakers, cooks, welders, soldiers especially that work with explosives, cooks, and other people who work with fire, as I mentioned, or high temperatures. People who have overcome their Cain impulse or who are repressing it usually enter fields related to theology, churches, nursing, surgery, or some other healing occupation. And this is because, remember, the opposite of killing someone is curing someone. So their vocational choice becomes a defense mechanism against that inner desire. People with the Cain complex also may be epileptic or schizophrenic. Now, it's important to distinguish between organic and affective epilepsy. Organic epilepsy is due to biological and neurological symptoms, while affective epilepsy is due to psychological ones, which channelize themselves through the body. So the disorder thus represents the person's internal mental life, explosive, hostile, and violent. Now, not all of these have to apply to someone for them to have it, and I by no means am diagnosing or giving therapy to anybody through this podcast, but if someone matches these descriptions of hatred, vindictiveness, and envy, and they're a sibling, it's likely that they have a Cain complex, which, as I mentioned, everyone has. The only difference between people who have these symptoms and people without it is that there are people who come to terms with that aspect of themselves, and there are people who don't. The people who don't have these symptoms, and the people that do don't. The line between sanity and insanity is very fine, and believe it or not, we cross that line several times a day without even realizing it. But the Cain complex can be very uncomfortable in families where it is very strongly pronounced and present. The Cain complex can create significant discomfort and tension within families. This psychological dynamic that is created because of it profoundly affects both the sibling who identifies with Cain, so the one that's driven by jealousy and resentment, and the other sibling who embodies Abel, the one who is perceived as favored or more successful. For the sibling embodying the Cain role, life can be a constant battle against feelings of inadequacy and envy. The person you're thinking about as I speak often perceives themselves as living in the shadow of the more favored Abel, which leads to a deep-seated resentment. The intense emotions that accompany the Cain complex can manifest in various ways. The first one would be through, of course, aggression and hostility. The Cain sibling may exhibit overt hostility towards their sibling, which can range from verbal conflicts, sarcasm, to more subtle forms of sabotage. Cain, when they were younger, used to play tricks on Abel. So this represents sabotage rather than direct and literal harm. This aggression is often a projection of their internal struggles as they seek to diminish the perceived superiority and success of their sibling. Another one that's actually interesting is isolation and alienation. Over time, the Cain sibling may feel increasingly isolated both within the family and socially. So eventually their jealousy and resentment spread. And whether they realize it or not, they distance people from themselves as well. Their instability and their inability to cope with their emotions leads them to a self-imposed isolation, and they distance themselves from the sibling that they view as the source of their pain. Despite the outward expressions of anger, the Cain sibling may also grapple with deep feelings of guilt and shame. Now, they usually will never express this, but these emotions stem from the awareness of their destructive impulses and the moral conflict between their feelings and societal expectations. On the other side, the able sibling, often seen as the favored or the more successful one, also experiences their own set of challenges. While they may appear to be the golden child on the surface, the Cain Complex exerts its influence on their psychological well-being as well. The able sibling may feel a lot of emotional pressure to live up to the expectations placed upon them, whether by their parents or by their society. And this pressure, of course, can create anxiety. They may also feel their own set of guilt and empathy as well, because the able sibling is usually, and at the very least, acutely aware, if not more, of their siblings' envy and resentment. And a lot of the times, unfortunately, parents aren't apt to see this or acknowledge this, because they rather pretend that if they don't see it, it's not there. So because of this, they may feel conflicted about their success, and of course this leads to a complex mix of empathy for their sibling and guilt over their own achievements. And of course, because of this causes strained relationships with their sibling, as you can expect, and they might find it difficult to connect or at least reconciliate or make sure that the Cain sibling doesn't feel this way. And this leads to feelings of loneliness or confusion, and of course lack of trust. And another side effect of this is collateral actual damage done if the Cain sibling has reached their peak multiple times, or at least one. Of course, like I mentioned, this is explosive. And the Cain Complex doesn't just affect the individual siblings. No, it reverberates throughout the entire family. The parents involved may feel torn between their children, and they struggle to manage this rivalry and the accompanying emotions. So the family environment, because of this, becomes charged with tension, and it becomes uncomfortable for all the family members, as well as difficult to remain secure and to feel like we can trust and love each other, of course. Now, if this jealousy is over one parent, this can be especially difficult because both parents are stuck in the middle. The one that is being fought over is torn because they love both their Cain and their Abel, and the one that is on the other side might feel like they have their hands tied and don't know what to do about it. Now, if it's a single parent environment, then the tension is worse because there's no other individual who can mitigate that tension. And later in the episode, I will discuss what to do if you're a parent and you're seeing these Cain strivings. And likewise, if you have a sibling who is popping up into your mind right now, I will go over what to do. But before I do, I want to talk about a topic that is important, and that is also the subtitle of my episode, which is Sibling Rivalry, and what it means in relation to this topic. Sibling rivalry is the rivalry and competitive impulse that surges between siblings who seek to compete with each other. Now, what is distinct, and it's important to know this, what is distinct between the Cain Complex and sibling rivalry is that the Cain Complex is sibling rivalry at its extreme pathological form. Sibling rivalry can refer to anything in that dimension, even an occasion where you strive to get a bigger house or a newer car than your sibling. But the Cain Complex obviously isn't just that. The Cain Complex clearly takes it a couple steps further than that. If a sibling of yours is jealous of you, vindictive, vengeful, or brings up tiny little things from 20 years ago that aren't even important, but to them it's like the greatest sin ever committed, and that's according to them why they do the things they do, that's the Cain Complex. That's what makes it different. The important aspect, though, that distinguishes the Cain Complex from sibling rivalry is that the Cainian person, in order to qualify as one, must deliberately cause pain or sabotage the other sibling. There has to be attacks of some way. This can be, for example, in the instance of two sisters, which, by the way, is very common, is that the jealous sister will steal the prettier sister's boyfriend and sleep with him. So that's an example of pain. Or the opposite. I have heard many a time the story of two brothers who have fought over a woman. And I'm sure you have as well. Now try and tell me the time where that ended well. It never does. After that threshold is crossed, there is always a downward spiral of hatred and revenge that occurs and doesn't end. Now, there are some factors that influence the birth of the Cain Complex, some of them being even out of control. For instance, the birth order greatly influences the likely manifestation of a Cain Complex. For example, there may be two children in one family, and by the principle of the number two, there is a natural, inherent, dualistic, competitive nature already established. But this nature is especially concretized when either both siblings are boys or both siblings are girls. That doesn't mean that a male child can't be jealous of a female sibling or vice versa. No, I've heard that story many times before as well. But it is more likely that siblings of the same sex are more competitive with each other. Also, whether the siblings are step or half or of the same blood also matters. Step siblings may not see each other as a threat so much, but rather as strangers or friends. Of course, as time moves on, they can evolve and even regard themselves as peer siblings, but the environment is different because both children have the rights to their respective parents, unless one directs attention to the other or there's a conflict with the respective parents' mate. Then there is an issue, but because of that, there usually isn't. But next in line are half-siblings, and have seen cases where one half-sibling regards the other half-sibling as inferior or superior, and typically because the circumstances of their birth are different. If the parent in common is able to mitigate any negative influences when the child is born, because of course a baby changes a schedule, the Cainian feelings will be less. Also, in regards to opposite sex siblings, I have usually seen it be where if the older brother has a younger sister, the older brother will usually be jealous of the sister, and that's usually a shock to some people because a lot of people say, no, I want him to be I want him to protect her. I want him to watch over her. I want to have an older boy first so he can guide her. But that isn't always the case because, and of course, this doesn't apply to all occasions, just some, because sometimes the older boy might wonder, why is my sister getting different attention than I am? Why do I have to feel so responsible for my younger sister? And of course, that involves educating them, showing them, being fair, having them understand what a sibling means, and remembering that all first siblings and all older siblings at one point were only children. Now, at the top of the list, of course, are full siblings, and this should largely be self-explanatory. Full siblings are, of course, in the most competitive environment, and they share the same resources and depend on the same people. So this is clearly a question of survival. There are also physical, psychological, and psychophysical symptoms that are associated with the Cain complex, those being epilepsy, suicidality, pyromania, criminality, delinquency, migraines, and stuttering. The birth order effect especially influences this matter. The birth order effect is a psychological effect that occurs in respect to the order in which a child is born in a family. Older children are more self-directive and independent, whereas middle children feel like they don't belong or they feel like they're out of place sometimes. Younger children often excel in things that they set their mind to because they grew up with all the lessons and guidance of the adults around them, as well as their older siblings. So younger siblings are typically idolized more. And this is reflected in mythology and legends in many ways. The youngest sibling of a story is almost always the hero. For example, Ariel in The Little Mermaid is the youngest of her sisters. In Swan Lake by Mattel, Odette has a sister, but this sister literally appears for only 30 seconds in the entire movie. Cinderella is the youngest among her stepsisters. Abel was a younger sibling. And in Hansel and Gretel, the younger sister, saves Hansel from being eaten by the witch, among others. So the birth order effect is obviously an influential factor in whether or not the Cain complex arises to be, and this, of course, is out of control mostly for the parents. Now, the birth order effect has received criticism, and I've heard people compare it to horoscopes, but that's not the case. It's based on environmental, sociological, and psychological influences upon the personality. And also, many people don't take into account that all older siblings at one point were only children. In addition, the closer in age siblings are, the more jealousy there is, because there's more similitude. Now, if the younger child is a baby, while this doesn't completely disregard the possibility of jealousy being born, does greatly mitigate it if the older sibling is several years older than the baby. And the reason being is that both child and parent can reason that the child being born is just an innocent baby incapable of doing any harm. And the birth order effect also resets after 4 years. So, for example, if a woman has 3 children at 23, no more than 2 years apart from each other, and then at 37 has another child, this youngest child that is born will not be raised as the youngest sibling, but rather as an only child, because the siblings would have grown up and left the house in most instances and left the parents all alone, and thus all their exclusive attention would be on the youngest sibling, who would be raised as an only child. Parents, if you are listening right now, I'm going to tell you an interesting and unique way to determine whether or not your young child has an inclination towards the Cain complex, or how to measure their Cain strivings. Observe how they feel about their siblings' safety. If a child is overly concerned about their siblings' safety or fearful of them being taken away or dying, it is a sign of repressed internal Cain. The over-excessive sense of fear and dread over their siblings' safety or death is a defense mechanism against the wish for their death. So that's something to keep in mind for if you're a parent. Rivalry and jealousy indicate a lack of self-assuredness. They indicate a lack of self-awareness as well. In my article, Jealousy and Its Discontents, I write that when someone feels jealous, rather than focusing more on the other person, we should focus more on ourselves and ask ourselves, why do I feel this way? Is such a person making me feel this way on purpose, or am I doing this to myself? Once we stop and ask these questions of ourselves, we will find the answer and clarification of many jealous fits, both with our partners and others. The Cain Complex provides a framework to understand child and adult sibling rivalry more deeply. It shows us where it can lead to and how it can transform people when it reaches unhealthy and even deadly extremes. Remember, within every Abel there is a Cain, and within every Cain an Abel. Within all of us, there are dark, deep, secret feelings that we wouldn't even tell our pillow about. But nonetheless, Whether one acts out these Cain characteristics consciously or unconsciously, we are still responsible for that internal Cain. Richard Hughes, a psychoanalyst, put that wonderfully. We all have Cain strivings, and they need not manifest explicitly in a sibling relationship. As mentioned, they can even manifest in crimes of passion, but it is this Cain complex that I mentioned that emerges when sibling rivalry is left unchecked, both by the individuals themselves and their parents. So the Cain within intensifies these already existing feelings of rivalry, and it leads to more severe conflicts and emotional distresses. These include sabotage, hatred, stealing, silence, indifference, physical attack, emotional attack, possessiveness, and intrusiveness. These are all ways that the Cain strivings within can manifest themselves in the context of a sibling relationship that's colored by envy, rivalry, and competition. So now, what do you do if you are an individual with intense Cain strivings or the Cain complex? Firstly, it would be essential to work with someone who is comprehensive on these matters and is understanding. Someone who can reach the profundity of these topics with you while also providing you with ways to grow. If you identify as someone who has a Cain complex, I recommend that you look also within yourself rather than other people and ask why you are unhappy with yourself in the first. Find the answer within yourself rather than in other people, and I'm sure you will direct your thoughts towards the correct direction, though that may not be enough. Now, for people who identify as able in this situation, do not internalize these feelings directly. You are not at fault and have not done anything incorrectly. If you feel like the burden of these situations are too heavy, I strongly recommend that you talk to someone who is likewise familiar with this topic. Now, for parents dealing with sibling rivalry, the good thing about the Cain and Abel story and the Adam and Eve saga is that it shows that families have been fighting since they were created. Adam and Eve had disagreements, and the first siblings ever born didn't have the most loving and affectionate relationship. So families have been arguing for thousands and thousands of years. Adam and Eve were a family, and just like any family, they had conflicts. There's literally a book called The Conflict of Adam and Eve. You know, this is more common than people think. You know, and just to think that family therapy was invented only 82 years ago. We're a couple millennia behind. But seriously now, if you are a parent listening to me and you can see within your family these traits, or at least want to prevent them, I want you to know that it's not easy. But the best thing that you can possibly do amidst all your discomfort is to tackle this issue as soon as possible. The issue with these complexes is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, they are very deeply rooted, as you can tell as well by listening to this podcast. And because of this, they are very difficult to resolve once someone is an adult. So the longer you wait, the more saturated their internal world will be with negative emotions. So I recommend you handle this as soon as possible. Harness your authority as a parent and address these issues directly by working with someone who is familiar with this topic and can navigate it in a caring, comprehensive manner. I also recommend that you stay as objective and neutral and fair among your children as possible. You know, whether you realize it or not, every child has a different mother. The mother is different to each one of her children, and this applies to fathers as well. But my point is that you must, in this circumstance, deliver a consistent image to all your children. You must realize that your children may not accept love the same way, and each child may require different things of you as well. I also recommend a lot of parents to just ask their children straightforward, what do you need from me? Am I doing enough for you? Do you feel supported by me? A lot of parents don't ask that because they think that they're doing the right thing. And while they might be doing the right thing, they might not be doing the needed thing. And that's why you should always ask your children. And when they tell you, listen, don't argue, their answer may surprise you. So in this episode, we've taken a deep dive into the Cain complex. a profound and often unsettling psychological dynamic rooted in sibling rivalry and jealousy. We explored what a complex is. We highlighted how these deep-seated emotions and experiences shape our behaviors and our life choices. By understanding the Cain Complex, we can see how intense feelings of envy and resentment can lead to destructive behavior and strained families. We began by discussing the general concept of complexes in psychology, and we moved on to the Cain Complex, and we examined how this specific complex manifested, and we analyzed the Cain and Abel saga and how this tale has been expanded and enriched, and how the Cain Complex is more than just a story of sibling conflict. It's a symbolic representation of the darker aspects of human nature that can emerge when envy and competition are left unchecked. We also explored practical advice for those who may be dealing with the Cain Complex in their own lives. And finally, we touched on the broader implications and how it affects the whole family. So in essence, the Cain Complex serves as a powerful reminder of the potential darkness that can reside within individuals and within families. And it challenges us to confront these uncomfortable truths, to understand that the internal Cain within us is there, and to strive for healthier, more balanced relationships. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode, and I hope it has provided you with valuable insights into the Cain Complex and its impact on sibling rivalry. If you would like to read or listen to my article on the Cain Complex, feel free to click the link to my article below called Understanding Cain. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this podcast, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up or a star. And if you would like 3 free sessions with me, plus a free consultation, click also the description box below. Stay tuned for next week, where I will be discussing another complex that affects relationships and has to do with them directly. The Fortunata Complex, a woman's emotional dependence on unavailable men. See you next week. Blessings.